The first Sunday dawned with a crispness the German prisoners did not expect. Beyond the barbed wire, a convoy of trucks idled, their engines rumbling like a distant reminder of war. Yet these trucks were not carrying munitions, not heading to the front. They were here for them. The defeated soldiers of the Reich, now disarmed and branded with stenciled numbers on their uniforms. Orders were given they were to board the trucks and be taken into town. Confusion rippled through the ranks. Rumors had spread in camp that something unusual awaited them. Some whispered of interrogations, others thought of propaganda films. But the truth would prove stranger still. The drive was short but surreal. Towns unfolded in front of them, neat houses with white fences, gardens green with life, and shops displaying food behind broad glass windows. No bomb craters, no rubble, no piles of bricks or broken tram lines like in Cologne or Hamburg. The war seemed absent here, as though America lived on another planet. The prisoners exchanged cautious glances. Where were they being taken? The trucks halted outside a church. A tall white steeple rose into the sky, its bell gleaming under the morning sun. To the Germans, it was an image almost obscene in its normality. Back home. Steeples had long since been reduced to ruins, their bells silenced by fire and shrapnel. The guards gestured for the prisoners to form lines. One of them muttered, almost with amusement, "Church service." The word fell among them like a stone in water. The doors of the church stood wide, unguarded, as if welcoming not just citizens, but also captives. The prisoners shuffled forward, still wary of a trick. Could this be true? Would Americans actually allow their enemies, men who had fought, perhaps even killed their sons and brothers, to step into a place of worship among civilians? Inside, the air was warm with the scent of polished wood and candle wax. Stained glass filtered the light into colors the Germans had nearly forgotten existed. The pews filled with local families, mothers with children, old men in suits, young women with hymn books in hand. No one shouted, no one spat. They simply made space, inviting the strangers to sit. The prisoners hesitated. Some looked at the guards, waiting for a signal, but the guards only nodded. One by one, they sat, uniforms stiff against the polished wood. Then the organ thundered. Deep notes rolled through the nave, echoing against the rafters. Voices rose to meet it. Hundreds of Americans singing together, filling the hall with power. The Germans stiffened. This was not the fearful silence of a blackout service in Germany, whispered hymns under dimmed candles. This was bold, unbroken sound, resonant with confidence. A prisoner from Hamburg, scribbling later in his diary, described the moment as a wall of light breaking into my ears. Another, from Saxony, recalled feeling as if the walls themselves breathed. Even the skeptics could not deny the force of it. In that moment, the contrast to home became unbearable. In the Reich, air raid sirens often cut church services short, scattering congregations into bunkers. Here, the only interruption was the laughter of a child. The prisoners shifted uncomfortably as the hymns swelled. Could this really be happening? Had America no fear of sabotage, no concern that these men, who only weeks before had fought against them, might seize the moment to rebel? One whispered in Germany, "Never would we allow this." Why do they? The question lingered. Was this mercy? Was it arrogance? Or was it something more dangerous, a quiet demonstration of strength? For if America could afford to open its doors even to enemies, what did that say about the certainty of its power? When the pastor finally spoke, his words were not of vengeance. He prayed for peace, for the end of bloodshed, for sons not to be lost on foreign soil. The prisoners bowed their heads reluctantly, unsure whether they were expected to join. Some refused. Others mouthed the Lord's Prayer silently, the words familiar across borders. And yet, even in their refusal, something unsettled them. This was no propaganda show. The civilians prayed sincerely, their faces marked not by hatred, but by hope. If the Reich had promised them that Americans were godless, chaotic, and cruel, then this morning had already cracked the first stone in that wall of belief. One POW would later write, "I entered that church as a prisoner. I left it not free, but no longer certain of what freedom meant. But what awaited them outside, beyond this single service, was even more shocking." The next Sunday, the ritual repeated, Trucks rolled out of the camp, dust rising behind them, carrying men who still struggled to believe what they had seen. The same white church steeple, the same open doors, the same families waiting inside. Yet this time, the prisoners were not as stiff. They knew now what awaited them: hymns, sermons, and the strange freedom of sitting beside the very people whose nation had defeated them. What struck them most was the sound. From the moment the organ roared to life, waves of music engulfed them. German hymnals existed, yes, but never sung with such sheer volume. American congregations sang as if no enemy bomber could ever silence them, voices rising high, almost defiant in their joy. A diary from a POW in Texas captured it. The people sang with lungs full, not just with mouths. They had no fear of raids, no fear of punishment for the wrong words. I could not recall such a sound since boyhood. For men raised on rationing, fear, and propaganda. The shock was not merely in the song itself, but in what it implied: confidence, security, and abundance. But if the sound astonished them, the sight left them reeling. Above their heads, chandeliers hung heavy with electric bulbs, dozens upon dozens glowing without interruption. In Germany, electric light had become a memory. Bombing campaigns had shattered the grid. Rolling blackouts left cities in darkness. Families crouched around single candles, children squinting to read. Here, every pew was bathed in light. Each bulb burned brightly, humming with a constant current. A single Sunday service consumed more electricity than a German household used in a week. One POW scribbled the comparison in disbelief. This church wastes in one morning what my entire street lacked in a month. It was more than light. It was a reminder of what power meant. America did not dim its lamps for fear of bombers. It did not ration bulbs. It illuminated its churches, its homes, even its barns, for the prisoners. The brightness was both dazzling and humiliating. When the organ thundered again, its pipes shuddered the very pews. The Germans exchanged glances. In their homeland, organs had fallen silent as churches collapsed beneath Allied bombs. Many had been dismantled for parts, their pipes melted down for scrap metal to feed the war industry. Yet here, instruments were not stripped for the front. They remained whole, maintained, polished. The church organist, a thin man with spectacles, played without hesitation, pounding keys that filled the hall with resonance. Each note seemed to mock the Reich's desperation. One prisoner, once a music student in Leipzig, whispered bitterly, "Our steel became bullets. Their steel became music." And so the questions deepened. If America could afford such light, such music, such unity even during war, what did that mean for Germany's future? Was the Reich truly destined to triumph, as Goebbels' radio insisted, or had they been fighting a giant too immense to comprehend? A Bavarian POW later confessed to a fellow inmate, "We were told America was chaos, yet their voices sing together stronger than any we have heard at home. If they are chaos, then what are we?" The doubts spread quietly, not shouted aloud, but murmured in barracks at night. The church service became more than worship. It became a mirror, reflecting their weakness against America's strength. When the congregation filed out, the POWs walked past families smiling politely, children tugging at mothers' skirts, men tipping hats in casual civility, not one word of insult, not one stone thrown. But as the trucks rattled back toward the camp, the men sat in silence. Some clenched fists on their knees. Others stared blankly at the countryside rushing past. A few still clung to the Reich's promises, muttering that this was a trick, a performance. Yet deep down, many knew the performance was too costly to be staged. If America could sing so loudly, light so boldly, and pray so openly, what else could it do that Germany could not? And what they would see in the weeks ahead would shatter even more of the illusions they had carried from across the Atlantic. It was not the hymns, nor the sermons, that most unsettled the German prisoners the following Sundays. It was the bread. When baskets were passed down the pews for communion, the loaves seemed endless, slices thick, crusts golden, not the dry, gray substitute of home. In Germany, bread had been cut thinner each year, flour stretched with sawdust, potatoes or chestnut meal. Women queued for hours, only to leave with rations that crumbled in their hands. Here, The baskets came again and again, as if the supply could not be exhausted. A POW officer, once in charge of the quartermaster duties on the Eastern Front, muttered under his breath, "One service, one church, feeds more than a garrison in Poland." The prisoners exchanged glances. Was this a trick of abundance, or was this truly the American reality? When the chalice passed, they tasted wine rich, sweet, plentiful. Wine in Germany had become scarce by 1943, commandeered for the Wehrmacht, reserved for officers. Soldiers on leave found only watery beer or ersatz brews. Yet here, even in a rural church in Texas or Georgia, wine flowed freely on a Sunday morning and after the service. Another astonishment coffee. Not the bitter surrogate brewed from acorns or chicory that Germans had endured for years, but true coffee, steaming from enamel pots, its aroma alone enough to silence the men. Cups were offered even to them. The prisoners, guarded yet unshackled. One POW later wrote, "To taste coffee again was to remember life before the war. It was as if we had left the Reich the moment we drank it." The abundance was not symbolic, it was measurable. According to U.S. Department of Agriculture figures, by 1944, America produced over 140 billion pounds of wheat annually. While Germany struggled to harvest even half that amount under Allied bombing and labor shortages, a single Midwestern farm might yield more grain than an entire German district ravaged by war. The prisoners could not ignore the numbers. In 1943, a German soldier's bread ration averaged 200 grams per day. In America, civilian consumption often exceeded a full pound daily for the first time. The captives began to compare, not in vague impressions, but in stark arithmetic. If one farm could feed thousands, if one nation could drink coffee while at war, what did that mean for the Reich that asked its people to tighten belts endlessly? That night, in the barracks, the talk turned bitter. "We were told the Americans starved their own." One soldier muttered, "We were told they lived in chaos." Another replied, "Then why do they pour wine like water? Why do they waste coffee on prisoners?" The conversation spread like fire. To admit the Reich had lied was dangerous even here, but the evidence was undeniable. Abundance was no rumor. It was in their hands, in their mouths, on their tongues. The more skeptical POWs warned against naivety. "This is propaganda," they said. "They are fattening us, softening us." Yet deep inside, even they wondered, could propaganda bake bread so fresh? Could it roast coffee so fragrant? One of the prisoners scrawled a note in his pocket journal. If a single American farm fed more than a German province, what did that mean for the Reich? The question echoed in others' minds as they tried to sleep. For years, they had been told Germany was destined to rule Europe, that the Reich's strength was unmatched. Yet here, far from the battlefields, America's quiet, casual generosity seemed to whisper a harsher truth. The Reich was not unmatched. It was outmatched. And bread, wine, and coffee were only the beginning. By late autumn, the POWs no longer shuffled into church with suspicion. They went with unease, but also with a gnawing curiosity. Every week, some new shock awaited them. This time, it was not the bread, not the wine, not even the hymns. It was the lights. The chandeliers overhead blazed with dozens of electric bulbs, burning without hesitation. In Germany, blackout curtains had become mandatory years earlier. Cities like Berlin and Hamburg had been forced into darkness, their power grids crippled by bombings. A single bare bulb was considered luxury, and even that flickered under rationed current. Yet here, a rural American church consumed electricity with casual extravagance. POWs calculated in whispers, one chandelier used more energy in an hour than a German village permitted in a day. The numbers were staggering. By 1944, the United States generated over 160 billion kilowatt hours of electricity annually, nearly double Germany's pre-war capacity, even as bombs pounded its cities. For the prisoners, the light was no mere glow. It was proof that America's war machine had energy to spare, light to waste. While the Reich withered in shadows, the organist struck the first notes, and once again the music shook the rafters. The POWs tilted their heads upward, studying the roof beams and fixtures, trying to calculate the construction. In Germany, even churches still standing bore scars, plaster crumbled, tiles missing, organs dismantled for scrap. Here, Everything was whole, strong, maintained. Even the roof beams were painted fresh, unscarred by shrapnel. One prisoner whispered bitterly, "We dismantled our cathedrals to forge bullets. They let theirs stand to sing." The contrast was unbearable. Each chord of the organ seemed to taunt them, each glowing bulb another reminder of what had been lost to ruin. According to U.S. Army Quartermaster reports, even POW camps themselves consume more electricity than entire German cities under rationing. One camp in Oklahoma recorded monthly usage of 70,000 kilowatt hours, enough to power 10,000 German homes in wartime. When the POWs compared these figures with what they saw in churches, the implications became undeniable. America was not only fighting a war, it was doing so while keeping its homes lit, its factories humming, and its churches ablaze in light. Could the Reich, clinging to ration cards and blackout drills, truly match this? As they rode back to camp, the men spoke less of hymns and sermons and more of electricity. For soldiers trained to measure war in logistics, kilowatts and coal tonnage were weapons just as real as rifles. If America could burn thousands of bulbs without flinching, what did that say of its factories, its shipyards, its steel production? One officer muttered into his collar, "We march in darkness. They pray in light." The Reich lied. Another remained silent, but clenched his jaw so tightly his teeth ground. They had believed in Germany's technological supremacy. Now even the lamps above a church pew told them otherwise. And yet, as overwhelming as the glow of electricity was, it was not the end of their astonishment. The following weeks would show them something even greater: the machines that moved America itself. For if the light of a single church revealed so much, what would they make of the fleets of buses and trucks that carried them there each Sunday, running on fuel their homeland no longer possessed? The question simmered, unspoken, as the trucks rattled back through the quiet American countryside. By winter, the POWs noticed something as striking as the church services themselves the way they arrived. Every Sunday morning, buses and trucks pulled into the camps, lined up in neat rows, engines idling. Not one or two vehicles, but convoys, enough to carry hundreds of men at a time. In Germany, fuel had become scarcer than bread. The Luftwaffe grounded aircraft for lack of gasoline. Panzer divisions rationed every liter. Civilians pushed bicycles fitted with wooden gasifiers, and horse-drawn carts replaced trucks in many towns. Yet in America, fleets of buses burned fuel simply to bring prisoners to church. One POW officer shook his head as he climbed aboard in the Reich. Even generals travel by foot. Here, they drive us like honored guests. The scale was undeniable. According to U.S. wartime records, more than 200,000 German POWs were transported weekly across America for various purposes: labor, cultural programs, and yes, religious services. In Texas alone, camps requisitioned over 30,000 gallons of fuel per month just for prisoner transport. The Germans whispered calculations in the back of the buses. Each vehicle consumed more gasoline in a single trip than entire German units received in a week. In 1944, America produced 4.7 billion barrels of crude oil. The Reich scraped by on synthetic fuel distilled from coal for every German liter. America had 10. The prisoners sat in silence, staring out the windows at endless highways. If America spent such resources on its captives, what did it lavish on its soldiers? The journey itself was revelation. The buses rolled over wide, unbroken asphalt roads, stretching mile after mile without crater or rubble. Bridges arched across rivers, railroads rattled with freight cars, all untouched by war in Germany. Every journey was an ordeal: bridges bombed, tracks twisted by air raids, roads pitted with shell holes. Supply convoys crawled, if they moved at all. Yet in America, transport was smooth, predictable, abundant. One prisoner pressed his forehead to the window and whispered, almost to himself, "This road alone is victory." The convoy halted at a church parking lot. Dozens of automobiles already lined the street: civilian cars, gleaming, polished, fueled without worry. Families stepped out carrying hymnals, their tanks filled while Germany's ran dry. The prisoners exchanged glances. They needed no sermon to understand the message. America did not only fight with guns and planes, it fought with oil wells, highways, factories, and fuel tanks that never emptied. The Reich had claimed to be an empire of iron and might, Yet here was proof that true power lay not in parades on Unter den Linden, but in the quiet regularity of buses that never stopped rolling. That night in the barracks, the talk was hushed but insistent. Could a nation with such transport, such fuel, such logistics ever be defeated? A sergeant from Bavaria put it bluntly, "Our tanks run dry. Their buses drive prisoners to prey. The war is already lost." And yet, what awaited them in the coming weeks would deepen the wound further. For beyond bread, beyond light, beyond convoys, America revealed something still greater, not only the power to feed and transport, but to heal. The first time it happened, the POWs thought it was coincidence. After the church service ended, instead of being herded straight back into trucks, a small group of prisoners was led to a side building. Curious eyes followed, hours later. Those men returned, speaking in hushed tones. They had been taken to a hospital. It was not a prison ward, not a barracks infirmary with thin blankets and aspirin tablets. It was a fully staffed American hospital, connected to the church's charity program. White halls gleamed with cleanliness, the air heavy with the scent of disinfectant instead of the sour rot of field dressings. Nurses moved briskly between wards, and on trays sat bottles labeled with strange names. One in particular spread quickly through whispers penicillin. In Germany, medicine had become scarce by 1944. Sulfa powders were rationed to officers, hospitals stripped of supplies by bombings and shortages. Wounded men on the Eastern Front often died not from bullets, but from infections untreated. Here, in America, the POWs saw penicillin used freely even for them, according to U.S. Army Medical Corps figures. By 1944, America produced over 2.3 million doses per month, enough to supply not only its own forces, but civilians and prisoners alike. A single dose that could save a limb, or a life, was administered to men who just weeks before had fought to kill Americans. A POW with a festering wound recalled his disbelief. "They gave me medicine worth more than gold. In Germany, even generals could not obtain such beyond the medicine." Another shock awaited. After some Sunday services, prisoners were allowed to hear choirs sing in hospital chapels, women's voices, children's voices, hymns carried on piano keys, for men accustomed to the groans of bomb shelters and the silence of blackout nights. This was an assault of tenderness. An officer, hardened by years on the Eastern Front, admitted later in his diary, "I did not weep when comrades fell, but I wept when I heard the children sing, for him and for many others." The music was more dangerous than propaganda. It reminded them of a Germany that no longer existed, of families scattered, of churches in ruins, of a culture consumed by war. By 1945, more than 370,000 German POWs were housed across 500 camps in America. U.S. Red Cross inspections recorded that over 90% of them received regular medical care often superior to what German civilians at home could expect under Allied bombing. The contrast was unbearable. In Hamburg, mothers watched children die for lack of antibiotics. In Chicago or Dallas, prisoners were treated with the latest medicine at the hands of strangers. What was one to believe that America was cruel, as Goebbels insisted, or that its strength lay in something far more insidious? Its ability to heal even enemies. The POWs began to grasp what church meant in America. It was not only hymns and sermons, not only bread and wine. It was hospitals funded by donations, nurses volunteering their time, medical supplies shipped in vast quantities. Faith was not abstract here. It took flesh and healed flesh. One man whispered in the barracks, "If this is their mercy, what chance had we in war?" And yet, the most disarming moment of all still awaited them. For while bread, light, transport, and medicine shocked the mind, it was Christmas that broke the heart. It was December 1944 when the POWs first felt the season stir. Snow dusted the camp fences, and rumors spread local congregations had invited them to Christmas Eve services. Many refused to believe it. Could it be true prisoners of war, men who had fought under Hitler's banners, allowed to step into American churches during the holiest night of the year? Yet the invitation stood. That evening, buses rolled again through quiet towns, headlights sweeping across snow-covered fields. Families carried candles and hymnals into churches glowing with warmth. For the prisoners, the sight was unbearable in its familiarity and its difference. In Germany, Christmas meant blackout curtains, rationed candles, and quiet meals of thin soup. Here, steeples shone with electric stars, trees sparkled with strings of bulbs, and bells rang openly into the night sky. Inside, the churches blazed brighter than any cathedral they remembered. A towering fir tree stood near the altar, covered in ornaments and tinsel, its branches heavy with electric lights. At its base, boxes wrapped in colored paper. Then the choir began. Women in white blouses, children in red sashes, voices rising together in carols that even the Germans recognized Stille Nacht, sung in both English and German. For a moment, language ceased to matter. Men who had expected only captivity closed their eyes and felt tears burn. One prisoner whispered, "Our homes lie in ruins, yet here, even the trees sing." When the service ended, the shock deepened. Congregants carried baskets forward apples, oranges, chocolate bars, cigarettes, wool socks, even pocket testaments in German translation. These were not leftovers. These were gifts. In Germany, Christmas tables sagged under hunger bread stretched thin, potatoes boiled plain, fathers gone to war or already buried. Yet here, Americans gave to their enemies what they themselves might have kept. Numbers tell the story. In 1944 alone, American churches donated more than 500,000 care packages for POWs across the country. In one Oklahoma camp, records show every prisoner received a small wrapped present. It was not propaganda, it was scale, logistics, and generosity combined. That night, back in their barracks, the prisoners unwrapped their gifts. Some held tins of candy, others knitted scarves. The men were silent, each retreating inward. For years, they had been told Americans were mongrels, cowards, materialists without soul. And yet, here they were singing, praying, giving. One POW scrawled in his diary, "How do we hate a people who give us Christmas?" For many, the ideology they had carried across the Atlantic cracked completely. They were still prisoners, still defeated soldiers, but now they were also witnesses. Witnesses to abundance that defied their leaders' lies. Witnesses to faith that built not just churches, but communities of light, medicine, food, and music. When the guards ordered lights out, the barracks lay in silence. Yet the prisoners did not sleep. They stared at their small gifts, at the memory of choirs and candles, at the taste of chocolate still lingering on their tongues. One question hung heavy in the cold night air. If the Reich had promised us 1,000 years of glory, why did we find true humanity here? In the hands of our captors. And with that, Christmas became not just a holy night, but the night when belief itself began to crumble. The story of German prisoners in America's churches was never meant to be written. Wars are remembered for their battles, their ruins, their dead. Rarely do we linger on the moments of quiet, the hymns, the bread, the candlelight. Yet for thousands of men in captivity between 1943 and 1946, those Sundays carved themselves into memory more deeply than any frontline order ever could. They had been taught that America was chaos, a nation without culture, without soul, but each service revealed otherwise. There was order in the pews, abundance in the bread, brilliance in the lights, strength in the convoys, and mercy in the medicine. Most disarming of all was the generosity of Christmas, the moment when enemies received gifts as if they were neighbors. The scale mattered. A single church could pour out more electricity than a German district, more bread than a regiment, more fuel for buses than panzer divisions rationed in weeks. These were not sentimental gestures. They were demonstrations of power, industrial, logistical, spiritual, and yet they were also human. The sound of a child's hymn could wound a soldier's heart more than artillery. For the prisoners, doubts seeped in not through defeat in battle, but through contradiction in captivity. How could the Reich's promises of superiority survive when reality proved otherwise? How could hatred endure when faith and mercy broke through barbed wire? In the end, it was not only bombs and bullets that shattered Nazi ideology, it was bread freely given, lights burning without fear, medicine offered without question, and voices raised in song. America's power lay not just in its armies, but in its ability to overwhelm with abundance and disarm with humanity. And so, for those men, Captivity became revelation,